The inevitability of death is something that haunts the minds of most men, often causing them to desperately lash out against the world in hopes of finding some sort of escape from it, or at least to put it off as long as they can. Though, even with that in mind, the concept of immortality within fiction is often depicted as more of a curse than a blessing, as in excluding yourself from a fact of life such as death, you end up losing touch with reality, watching agelessly and unaffected as those around you crumble and pass, eventually changing these beings into something that is more akin to a monster. And this element of immortality has become a staple for the writing of vampires in most works, but we can also see it in motion through the blade-brandishing bisexual battle-ready bloodbiter, Vamp, of the Metal Gear Solid series.
ください。新しい恋はもっとドキドキする。超本格かくれんぼメタルギアソリッド2。
Vamp was a founding member of the anti-terrorist organization turned rogue unit, Dead Cell, and reoccurring minor antagonist throughout the whole of the Metal Gear Solid series, being a sort of rival for Raiden as he appears specifically in the games where Raiden is most prominent, that of course being Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4. And while his expertise with blades and dexterous movements make him a fearsome foe to go against on the battlefield, what has helped him persist between these multiple global incidents is his quasi-immortality brought on by an experimental nanomachine project that he was subjected to early into his military career. Something that, while it ensured his survival, also guaranteed his loss of sanity, with everyone he cares about perishing and leaving him behind. Though, before we can get too deeply into that, let's first discuss the meaning behind his name and design. Starting first with his name, which we only really know his Dead Cell's codename, that of course being Vamp. And given that Metal Gear is a series that is published by Konami and it has had references to Castlevania in the past, as well as Vamp being specifically Romanian in origin, having an affinity for blood, and sharp canine teeth that resemble fangs, and if you look into Kojima's game plan for Metal Gear Solid 2, Vamp was intentionally going to be repelled by crosses that both Raiden and Pliskin would wear. It is very clear that Vamp's codename is in direct reference to vampires.
No, Vamp isn't for vampire, it's because he's bisexual.
It's true. In-universe, Vamp's codename is actually in reference to his bisexuality, which may seem strange on the surface, but is actually based on a pretty outdated British slang for a female manipulator. A vamp is someone who uses their body to seduce men to do what they want, which is of course in reference to Vamp seducing the Marine Commandant Scott Dolph, and later his daughter Helena. Now this name was likely decided early on, and it made more sense for Vamp's initial design, as he was originally conceived to be a she, being the major female member of Dead Cell, and likely the Sniper Wolf surrogate for their Foxhound parallels. As well, this original design resembled the typical femme fatale found in the films that inspired Metal Gear in the first place. Though, when Fortune was added to the story of Metal Gear Solid 2, it was decided to change Vamp into a man. Now, his current appearance, from the long black hair, goatee, and general shirtlessness, as well as his dancing mannerisms, all draw heavy influence from the Spanish ballet and flamenco dancer Joaquin Cortez, who had recently not only moved to New York, a key focus of Metal Gear Solid 2's story, but made an appearance on 1999's Oscar ceremony, which occurred merely 2 months after Metal Gear Solid 2 had begun development. So Cortez may have been fresh in the mind of character designer Yoji Shinkawa. As well, it appears like Vamp's character was designed in a way to utilize his redesign to mix together the femme fatale origins with a new masculine figure, with the more feminine side of him being how he uses the emotions of others as a tool of social manipulation, seen not only in reference to his connection to the Commandant and how he speaks to Fortune, but of course in how his voice is described to have a sort of hypnotic element to it, which was represented greatly in the softness in which he spoke, creating both a creepy but intimate sound. With voice actor Phil Lamar describing how he created Vamp's voice was by removing as much air from his lungs as he could when speaking, to create the sound of someone who was on the end of every breath with each word.
5 today. Or rather 6. Unfortunately, hell had no vacancies.
while the newer, more masculine side of Vamp took the form of his physical tools, such as his literal physical appearance or abilities, right down to his weapon of choice being a knife. This knife, of course, being holstered right over his groin. Which, of course, leads right into another key part of Vamp's own character design, the inherent sexual or erotic side of Vamp, as if being named after his sexuality, and of course being based off vampires, wasn't a clear enough distinction that there was something sexual about his character. As in the same interview with Lamar, it is said that a key element of Vamp's character that was pitched to voice actors was his vague sexuality, which, knowing this, repaints a lot of his character, from the manner in which he studies and describes the twitching of muscles, to the literal thrusting of his phallic symbol into others so that he can drink their fluids, which all of these elements are cranked up even more in his appearance in Metal Gear Solid 4. As well, the designs of Vamp and Raiden mirror each other in Metal Gear Solid 2, with Vamp's character becoming aggressively masculine while being motivated by love and admiration, elements that are usually deemed as more feminine, while Raiden is directly feminine appearance while harboring a past literally built off the weaponization of masculinity.
We were shown Hollywood action films every day, the kind with macho guys and big guns. They call it image training.
Overall, it seems like Vamp's design is intentionally done in a way to play foil to Raiden like his own Liquid Snake, which of course is slightly reinforced in Metal Gear Solid 4 by having Vamp not only work with Liquid Ocelot, but have Vamp literally repeat the speech that Liquid gave his soldiers on Shadow Moses, though this only occurs in the Japanese version of the game. Now of course, while it should be noted that Vamp's codename does not come from Vampire, he takes clear inspiration from vampire mythos, with Vamp's origins being very similar to that of 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula movie, with the death of a loved one, the destruction of a cross, and the drinking of blood within a church ravished by war being what leads them to where they are now, as Vamp's backstory directly involves him getting pinned under a cross in a crucifixion-like position and being forced to drink the blood of his dead family members in order to survive, which was always planned for his character since the onset, as if we read Kojima's grand game plan, with the bomb that destroyed the church being a mistake by Peter Stillman, and that Vamp was originally going to be repelled by crosses due to a violent PTSD reaction, though these elements were removed from his backstory in the final game, and redistributed elsewhere. Vamp also possesses supernaturally heightened senses, such as a sense of smell. This allowed Vamp to identify Solid Snake by the scent of his blood being similar to that of Solidus Snake, which seems to be a direct reference to Castlevania Symphony of the Night, when Alucard is able to identify Richter as a Belmont based off of the smell of his blood, reinforced in part by the fact that Vamp, in Metal Gear Solid 2 specifically, is voiced by the Japanese voice of Alucard. Now, alongside his superhuman senses, Vamp also possesses vampire-like supernatural abilities, also seen by Alucard, such as superhuman strength and speed. Being not only able to casually lift a fully grown man with one hand, Vamp can also run across or stand on the surface of water, even water with no buoyancy. As well, he is able to dexterously dodge and deflect bullets with his knife in a dancing-like rhythm, tied back of course to his inspiration of Joaquin Cortez. He is even able to seemingly vanish without a trace and navigate areas in utter silence, being depicted as almost flying through these areas. And of course, he can use those enhanced senses of his to accurately predict what his opponent is going to do next, by reading the slightest twitches in their muscles. Though, this ability can be countered by adding a level of unpredictability to the movement, represented by the player taking direct control over Raiden using the first-person function of Metal Gear Solid 2, to wearing a pressurized suit that masks one's natural motion. Though, that second one only works for a limited amount of time, as Vamp can learn to adapt and read a suit. Now, it's this mixture of superhuman abilities in his tactical mind that has allowed Vamp to become a Wizard of Knives, like Pliskin says. And this title is all too fitting, given that Vamp is able to utilize techniques that are equated to literal magic, because in Metal Gear Solid 2, Vamp has the ability to run across water and manipulate people's shadows with his knives, which both seem to be based off of the legendary mystical or magical ninjutsu arts, which were popularized by plays and theaters in early Japanese. These arts being Mizukumo and Kage Nu, or in English, water spider technique and shadow binding technique. technique. Starting first with water spider technique, as it is said that a well-trained ninja is capable of manipulating their body weight so that they can properly use a special pair of boots in order to stand on or walk across surfaces of water. And while Metal Gear Solid 2 doesn't spend time explaining away Vamp's abilities, Guns of the Patriots does, and it justifies Vamp's water walking, as well as his ability to climb vertical surfaces, using the Van der Waals force, which is a force of molecular physics I am not educated enough to really talk about, but essentially it is used to justify why specific characters can cling impossibly to surfaces that appear smooth, with Otacon even mentioning this is how geckos tend to hang onto glass surfaces like they do. Now, alongside his water walking, ninjas are also sometimes depicted as being able to pin someone's movement by piercing their shadows with a kunai or shuriken, and Vamp is capable of doing the very same thing in his boss fight with Raiden. Though, if you were to reach out to Pliskin or Otacon, they would try to explain how the technique itself works, hypothesizing that Vamp is utilizing a powerful form of hypnosis via his movements, manner of speaking, and the lighting of the room. Also, Raiden would believe that he is pinned in place by his shadow, which initially sounds like Metal Gear just trying to demystify itself again, but is actually exactly how shadow binding itself is suggested to work, as it is considered to be a psychological attack rather than pure magic, which is reinforced by Raiden being able to counter the technique by shattering the lights around the room. Also, Metal Gear Solid 4 Otacon also suggests that Vamp's enhancements and abilities, even though they do have scientific origins, stretch into the realms of magic no matter what. Though what truly feels like magic is Vamp's seeming immortality, as throughout the entirety of his appearances, Vamp has been killed roughly 6 times. The first 3 of these deaths occurred in Metal Gear Solid 2, while the other 3 happened in 4. Now, the first of these many deaths came in the form of a ricocheted bullet intended for Fortune that pierced his forehead, which initially put him down but did not stop him, as soon after he would revive, only to end up getting put down yet again and then drowned in the water filtration chamber of the big shell. But it was 3 strikes and he's out when he emerged from the water like a terrifying dolphin to hold Emma hostage, as Raiden puts a sniper rifle shot between his eyes. Though, he does end up surviving this encounter, even within the realms of Metal Gear Solid 2, as even though it was less pronounced than his other revivals, he does appear as an Easter egg in the background at the end of the game. Now, there are a few elements of Vamp's own character that seem to have been put in to imitate members of Foxhound from the original game. As I mentioned before, his seductive side and his initial plans to be female show a clear sign that he is supposed to be the Sniper Wolf inspiration. Though, in the main game of Metal Gear Solid 2, he also resembles Vulcan Raven very closely. Firstly, Vamp appears early on to pilot a combat vehicle which you need to take down from a grounded location similar to the tank boss fight from the original game, which was also revealed to be where Vulcan Raven was hiding. As well, Vamp's shirtless demeanor and supernatural abilities seem to relate him back to Vulcan Raven's own shaman nature, though a good few elements of these resemblances were actually only inherited by Vamp in the final stage of development for Metal Gear Solid 2, and weren't always his, as these were all supposed to go to another Dead Cell member who you would meet and fight throughout the game, named Chinaman, who was a mystical martial artist who was visually inspired by Jet Li. They also possessed a magic dragon tattoo that would come to life when they entered water and attack the player during their boss fight. Though, due to both technical challenges involving the gimmick, and of course his codename being deemed rather inappropriate, the character was killed off screen and Vamp inherited his gimmick and boss room. So if this isn't supposed to be Vamp's boss room, and he wasn't supposed to be the one running across water and then up the pillar, that means that he likely wasn't the one piloting the fighter jet, which also leads me to believe that Vamp was likely intended to be fought earlier into the game than we do so now. As I mentioned before, Metal Gear Solid 2 has a lot of references or reuses of Metal Gear Solid 1's story beats, which is of course an intentional part of the game's overall narrative and of course its meta-narrative of creating a sequel. So it is rather weird that Vamp appears in a cutscene resembling that of Cyborg Ninja's pre-boss fight cutscene, as Raiden wanders into a room littered with bodies and watches as someone gets cut down by a blades expert. Doubly so when we take into account that Cyborg Ninja was Grey Fox, who is supposed to be dead, very similar to how Vamp views himself. As well, following this encounter, Raiden gains access to a very vital ally in the form of Pliskin, similar to Snake meeting Otacon following the Cyborg Ninja fight. So, it's honestly natural to assume that you may have fought Vamp here in a closed-off arena-like room. He even jumps around and hides in the cutscene, similar to what Cyborg Ninja does in his. Though, this is just my speculation about a game we never got. I just thought it was weird and wanted to point this out, especially knowing how much of Vamp was inherited from other characters. Now, a boss fight he seems to actually reference from the original game, which also seems to be intentionally tied to his character and not something he inherited, is of course another element that reinforces his Sniper Wolf connection, with Vamp taking Emma hostage during her escort mission, as this places the player into a similar panic of when Meryl gets shot by Sniper Wolf following the Psycho Mantis boss fight, with both fights needing the player to have their sniper rifle and to avoid letting the hostage die. As well, Meryl getting shot here is what allows her to be captured by Foxhound and later tortured by Ocelot, which of course can result in her death depending on the player's own actions. Similar to how, even if you can defeat Vamp in this section, you can't save Emma, and Vamp will just get back up later, as his ability to revive from death is an element that is supposed to seem supernatural as far as Metal Gear Solid 2 is concerned, and it goes essentially unexplained there. He is supposed to just be a monster, a physical force who can overpower even the previous game's power fantasy character of Solid Snake, and he is someone the player is meant to fear and hate, which is why they had Vamp deal the fatal blow to Emma to reinforce this, as she embodies an innocent, some hope of the future, someone a Kamen Rider would protect, and only a monster would destroy. And his role as a monster is greatly reinforced in the story of Metal Gear Solid 4, as while Vamp has a good chunk of his character demystified, with his immortality even being reduced to simply the result of an experimental nanomachine system he was injected with early into his military career, him being an experiment in the first place has great connections to what seems to be his main influence following 2, as this project was headed by Naomi Hunter, who has messed with genes and nanomachines in the past, and is the one who injected Solid Snake with Fox Dye as a revenge ploy all the way back in the original game. She now takes on a sort of Victor Frankenstein-like role in Metal Gear Solid 4, but we'll get more into detail on that later into the video. Now, while Naomi's experiment here was extremely successful, it would unknowingly cause Vamp to become desensitized to pain and violence, pushing others away and slowly developing into a killing machine, as following this treatment, Vamp would end up gaining membership with the US Navy, and soon enough he would become one of the founding members of Dead Cell, which is an anti-terrorist organization based on the real-life Red Cell. And while Vamp may seclude himself from most other people, he was fiercely loyal to that of Dead Cell, and specifically that of Colonel Jackson, as it is Jackson's wrongful imprisonment, and later his death in said prison, being what pushed him over the edge to become a terrorist. As well, he voices his disapproval when his allies go against honoring the Colonel that they did this entire mission for. But even if he disproves upon their actions, Vamp still honors his fallen brothers in Metal Gear Solid 4 by taking on their dog tags in memorial to them, which leads me to discussing Vamp's Metal Gear Solid 4 design in general, as it not only speaks about a lot of the changes that he has undergone, but also fits very well with the tone Kojima was going for in Metal Gear Solid 4. Now, Vamp, during Guns of the Patriots, really references his own character design roots, as he not only maintains his flamenco dancer style of movement and fighting, but he also does so while wearing the bottom half of a Frog Soldier uniform, which the Frog Soldiers is an all-female soldier unit, which harkens of course back to his original plans of being female. As well, while the original Vamp's pale nature sort of depicted him as more vampire-esque, with the aged and depressed nature of the story for Metal Gear Solid 4, it repaints a picture of Vamp's own character to make him appear more corpse-like, with the pulsating veins tensed up and visible under his nearly transparent flesh, and his regeneration showing some signs of rust, with the wound from the big shell still firmly planted on his forehead. As well, he fights more monstrously during Metal Gear Solid 4, dislocating his body parts and intentionally impaling himself in order to gain the upper hand. As well, he's just a lot less clean-shaven, showing clear signs that he's no longer maintaining his appearance, with the hair on his face growing out alongside inside his jawline, and of course his chest becoming covered, which ends up hiding the knife wounds he would inflict on himself during the Big Shell incident. This new appearance for Vamp is a clear sign of his own depression, especially when you mix in his longing for death that he keeps talking about, which some people assume, given his knack for inheriting other Dead Cell members' traits, this comes from fortune, but I believe this more stems from a feeling of being left behind by all of his closest companions, from his family to his loved ones, and of course now, Dead Cell, which is a motivation I feel is reinforced by him eventually deciding to side with the man responsible for the slaying of his last remaining ally atop of Arsenal gear, with the hopes that would either bring him death or the destabilization of the world that created him. And his cries for death would eventually be answered in the form of his foil, the protagonist of Metal Gear Solid 2 and future cyborg ninja, Raiden, with 4 really emphasizing their connections, as both of them come from homes that were destroyed by war, were later shaped into killing machines with a thirst for blood, and eventually were experimented on and shaped into a nigh unkillable tool of destruction. And with Vamp's return, we can even see one of Raiden's pivotal moments of discarding the dog tags at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2 and separating himself from the world's control be directly paralleled by Vamp's attachment to the past by him donning the aforementioned dog tags of his former companions. These two have continued to play mirror to each other throughout the whole series, and works well to highlight key elements of Vamp's character, which that being, he has no passion for life or desire for anything. In becoming immortal, he cut himself off from ever feeling human again, which essentially drove him into becoming nothing more than a tool for other people's wars. From the Patriots to Solidus to even Ocelot. Since the day war took his family away from him and he was forced to drink their blood to survive, Vamp has never taken control of his own life's actions, considering himself dead from that moment.
I died once already. I can't die twice.
So much so that even in his final moments, Vamp still struggles to take control, as after fighting Raiden during the raid on Shadow Moses and being defeated, Vamp's aged nanomachines finally began to reach their limit. With this, he began to convulse in extreme pain, as his body refused to let him die, but also lacked what they needed to repair it. Naomi then offers up a solution to this, a suppressive agent that would disable the nanomachines within him and let Vamp finally know death. But she hesitates herself in doing this, instead passing the burden on to Otacon, someone who holds a vendetta against Vamp for killing his sister back on the Big Shell. Though, after Otacon himself hesitates in this action, Vamp snatches the injector and uses it, which at first might seem like a final moment of taking his life into his own hands, but he ends up following this soon with a request, permission to die, which, after he is given the affirmation he needed, his soul is finally released, and his body stretches out into a crucified-like position, mirroring what he considered to be his first death all those years ago. And this story of creation and creator, a cycle of death and being haunted by the past, greatly resembles the writing of Mary Shelley's own Frankenstein, as Naomi Hunter takes on this role as Victor Frankenstein, someone who ends up deeply regretting her time meddling with the laws of nature and playing with the concept of life and death. Thus, she seeks out a way to destroy said past. Though, as she does this, Naomi is also constantly pursued by that same past in the form of Vamp, a creature responsible for the death of countless innocents, such as Emma, whose death could be in parallel to Elizabeth's own death in the novel. Though eventually, the creator and creation reunite within the Arctic. Now, to be fair, I don't know if Shadow Moses is actually directly in the Arctic Circle. I just know that part of Alaska tends to be, so I'm just going to assume Shadow Moses is part of the Arctic. The main part is that they reunite within a snowy area. It's not, the heavy details don't matter that much. Though the reunion is racked with guilt and sorrow, with both of them eventually losing their life. Though, while in the novel, Frankenstein dies first, and the monster follows soon after, and Metal Gear Solid 4, the placements are reversed. And Naomi is even able to pass on her story in the form of the Fox Alive virus uploaded at the end of the game, the same way Frankenstein is able to pass on his story to Captain Walton before dying. It's kind of ironic that Vamp, a character who has a very close connection to vampires, ends up representing Frankenstein's monster more than Dracula. In both narrative, but especially so in a meta sense, with him being assembled from the corpses of those around him, be it the gimmicks of the unused characters to the literal blood of his dead family member. He is someone drenched in death, and is always surrounded by it, but was never able to experience it himself. And even with his passing, he brought no peace to those who witnessed him, with Otacon feeling more empty with his death, while Naomi was filled with regret. And in the long run, thanks in part to a lot of the additional elements of his character being added to Vamp following Metal Gear Solid 2, which, if you didn't know, was originally intended to be the end of Kojima's vision for the series, it's actually been made more difficult to discern who or what Vamp truly was outside of a monster. Maybe that's exactly the way he was intended to be viewed. A monstrous creature of the night that we need to put down. You know, kind of like a... And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. Every little bit helps keep this channel flowing as smoothly as it does, and if you want to see a Vamp of your own, well, you can find many of them within Shimonetta, a boring world with contradictory jokes doesn't exist at, byshimonetta.com.